Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to Office Hours with Michael Kitces. So for this week's discussion, I want to talk about the big news that hit this morning, which is the release of the revised second edition proposal of the CFP Board's new standards of conduct for CFP professionals. So some of you may recall, this has actually been a 2-year process in the making from the CFP Board. So it started all the way back in very late 2015 with the formation of a commission on standards, a 12-person committee that was going to be tasked with updating our standards of professional conduct that we as CFP certificates have to follow for what will be the first update since 2007. So after an 18-month process in early summer of this year, 2017, the Commission on Standards had released its first proposal on what those new standards of conduct would look like, which most notably included an expansion of the fiduciary duty to all CFP professionals who provide any kind of financial advice to consumers, which included not just comprehensive financial planning, but any kind of advice, which was broadly defined to include even just a suggestion to a client to pursue some course of action, such as whether to buy or sell any financial services product. So in essence, even product sales by CFP certificates would finally be subjected to a fiduciary duty under the CFP Board's proposed standard. Now, beyond that, the CFP Board standards proposal had a lot of other new elements as well. It expanded the 6-step financial planning process into a 7-step process by basically separating out the development of plan recommendations from the presentation of plan recommendations, recognizing with the growth of back office payer planners who don't create, or should I say, who create but don't necessarily present plans. So we needed to separate those out. The proposal limited the use of the term fee-based, declaring that CFP professionals can't use the label in a manner that even implies they're fee only if they're not. And the proposed new standards of professional conduct created a bunch of new disclosure requirements for CFP professionals, including not just more specific disclosure requirements when the client engages us in financial planning, but a new introductory information disclosure requirement that CFP professionals would have to give in advance when working with the client. The sheer complexity of adopting new standards like this for what are now almost 80,000 CFP professionals for the first time in the decade means there's a lot that goes into it. And so the CFP Board appropriately put all these proposed changes out for a 60-day public comment period for feedback over the summer, including a bunch of town hall meetings they conducted with certificates. And they got a lot of feedback. What we've now found out, there were over 1,300 public comment letters filed, more than any other proposal that the CFP Board has ever put forth. And many included, frankly, a rather lengthy public comment letter that I put forth with lots of suggestions that we post on Nerd's Eye View, actually suggested that there was so much to adjust in the first proposal, even though it was well-intentioned and on a good track, that there should be a revised proposal with a new second comment period. And so today, we actually have the release of the new revised second version of the proposed standards of professional conduct for CFP professionals, and the announcement there will be a new second public comment period opening up January 2nd and running for 30 days until February 2nd. So for this office hours, I want to talk about a few of the changes and the revisions that were made to the original proposal. Some good and some concerning. Now, first and foremost, again, when you subject 17 pages of professional standards to 1,300 public comment letters, you're going to get a lot of small tweaks, which I actually think is good. I wish the CFP Board would put all of their proposed changes to any of the 4 E's, so the experience requirement, the exam requirement, the educational requirement, and the ethics requirement, through this process, and not just changes to the ethics and standards of conduct, because feedback like this helps catch both small mistakes and unintended consequences. And so in this context, there were a lot of small tweaks made. The requirement that a CFP professional may not accept gifts or other benefits from clients if it will compromise their objectivity was clarified. That means a gift, a gratuity, entertainment, any other non-cash compensation. There was a requirement that CFP professionals not use the term fee-based to imply they're fee-only if they're not. And it was expanded to stipulate the CFP professional can't use fee-based or any other not fee-only term that might imply or sounds like fee-only. Which I think was important because, as I pointed out in my own comment letter, if all the CFP Board did was crack down and say you can't use the fee-based label, it would just lead advisors to make up other new terms, fee-oriented, fee-compensated, fee-for-service, that might still really actually be fee and commission models. So in the second version of the standards, it's much clearer. You can't imply you're fee only if you're not. Now, the CFP board notably isn't limiting the use of commissions at all. This is not about a compensation bias of the CFP board. This is a truth in advertising requirement that you have to accurately state your compensation, whatever it is, and, the word only and fee only has a kind of a specific meaning. So CFP board is just making sure that advisors are clear about their descriptions. Now, some other notable changes in the compensation area in particular was a clarification that even salary-based advisors who receive bonuses for product sales have to still disclose that as sales-related, i.e. commission compensation, because they're getting bonused. It's basically the equivalent of a commission. Although other internal revenue-based compensation for fee-only firms is fine as long as they're essentially revenue sharing of fees. And also a new provision that would allow advisors who use third-party TAMPs, so turnkey asset management platforms, to collect and remit their fees without running afoul of the fee-only rules just because they outsource investment management to a third-party provider instead of hiring a CFA internally to run their models. A couple other notable changes, the documentation requirements for CFPs were kind of clarified and simplified a little, including some of the reporting requirements back to CFP board. Under the existing rules, anytime you have a regulatory infraction, you need to tell the CFP board. Now they, I think, reasonably exclude minor rule violations if it was a less than $2,500 fine. They clarified what constitutes family and common control business entities under the related party rules for those who might have been shifting compensation from one entity to another. Overall, I think these are all good and reasonable changes. There were maybe a few that still need to be refined further. For instance, at the point the CFP board says any not fee-only label has to disclose that someone receives fees and commissions, I don't know why they don't just say the required categories are either fee-only or commission and fee and even talk about fee-based at all. Like, let's just define clear categories. But most of these new revisions are a positive step forward and a good example of how a rulemaking process can actually go well when you open up for public comments and feedback. Now, all that being said, I do want to highlight a few areas in the new revised standards of professional conduct that I think are more concerning. The first is that under the original proposal, the CFP board proposed that there would be expanded disclosure requirements for CFP professionals, not just when the client engages the advisor, but also with what was called a new initial disclosure information document that would have to be given to prospects detailing the nature of the CFP professional services, description of how they're compensated, and a summary of their conflicts of interest. Which should sound familiar, because that's basically what an RA's Form ADV Part 2 requires now. And in fact, the proposal explicitly stated that a properly completed and delivered Form ADV Part 2 would satisfy this requirement for the client. And so the CFP board had gone further and said, well, basically that means RAs will comply with this with Form ADV Part 2, and for non-RAs, i.e. the broker-dealer community, they would need to use something substantively similar, and the CFP board was going to make a model template that broker-dealers could use. But here, the broker-dealer community pushed back really hard in their comment letters, both directly and through their lobbying organizations like FSI and SIFMA, claiming that this new initial disclosure requirement in particular would be too onerous for them. After all, the reality is most RAs make this disclosure one or two or three advisors at a time, since most of us in the RA community are small. Even large RIAs have maybe a few dozen advisors and typically operate under a standardized structure for which you can have one standardized Form ADV Part 2. If you're a broker-dealer, though, you may have hundreds or thousands of advisors on your platform. If you're an independent broker-dealer, each of them could have a different business model and services and disclosure document, which is really hard to supervise if you're a broker-dealer, especially because this kind of upfront information would likely itself be treated as advertising communication with the public under FINRA Rule 2210, which means the broker-dealer would have a duty to engage in compliance oversight of every unique CFP disclosure document for every registered rep that had the CFP marks, which is a really challenging cost layer. And while I'm all for clear disclosures, it is a practical reality that there are advisors and RAs, and there are advisors at broker-dealers, and while RAs may already have the systems in place for these kinds of upfront disclosures, because we're already required to produce Part 2 of Form ADV, broker-dealers don't have this in place. And it's tough for the CFP board to require something that even the SEC and FINRA don't require in the broker-dealer community right now. And so the CFP board backed off this upfront disclosure requirement and simply said that all the at the time of engagement disclosures will still exist, and they're going to create a model pre-engagement disclosure that can be used voluntarily by broker-dealers, but won't be required of all CFP professionals. And all of the remaining disclosures that were going to be in that initial regarding description of services, how the advisor will be compensated, etc., gets moved to the time of engagement disclosure, along with the clarification that CFP professionals providing financial planning have to clearly define the scope of their planning engagement. So overall, I think it's very unfortunate that the CFP board backed off this initial disclosure requirement, but I do understand it. From a practical perspective, CFP certification is a voluntary designation. Its standards are voluntary. That means they can be over and above the minimum regulatory requirements, but they still have to be administratively feasible to comply with those higher standards. And arguably, this upfront disclosure requirement was one that would create legitimate challenges for large non-RIA firms. In part because of that conflict, that what is disclosure for CFP board purposes is actually advertising for FINRA purposes. And that's the problem with having advisors subject to all these different regulators and standards as we are. Hopefully someday we'll simplify that process, and then perhaps upfront disclosures can be revisited. But for now, we can at least be satisfied that disclosures are required at the time that the CFP professional is actually going to engage the client. Now, one other thing that came through under the revised standards of conduct that I do think is actually a little bit more concerning is a shift in the presumption of when a CFP professional is actually doing financial planning or not. So this distinction between CFPs who do financial planning and those who don't has actually long been a major issue under the CFP board's standards of conduct. So under the current rules, even as they exist today, there's effectively a loophole that allows CFP professionals to escape their fiduciary duty under the CFP board standards, because the current rules state that a CFP professional only has a duty to clients, only has a fiduciary duty to clients when doing financial planning or material elements of financial planning. Which means basically you can put CFP on your business card, say you're a financial planner, sell whatever you want, and have no fiduciary duty to clients as long as you say, oh no, I wasn't actually doing financial planning, I was just selling a product. Even though you were marketing yourself as a certified financial planner. In other words, the fiduciary duty for CFP professionals didn't apply because you were being a CFP. You had to be doing financial planning. And this difference in fiduciary duty between doing planning versus being a CFP professional was viewed appropriately, I think, as a loophole in the CFP board's current standards. And so it was a big deal this summer when the new standards for professional conduct were released, because the new rule became fiduciary at all times as a CFP professional. As long as you have the marks and you provide any kind of financial advice, which, as we noted earlier, is very broadly construed to not just doing planning, but any time you make any kind of recommendation on any financial services product, all CFP professionals would be a fiduciary. And in addition, the CFP board introduced a rebuttable presumption that any time a CFP professional was engaged by a client, it is presumed that they're doing financial planning and would have to adhere to the 6-step, now 7-step financial planning process and practice standards unless they could prove that they were not doing financial planning. Now, this matters because in the revised standards, the second edition that just came out, the CFP board has dropped this rebuttable presumption. So as it stands, all CFP professionals will still be fiduciaries when providing financial advice, which includes product sales, but there's no presumption that they're actually doing financial planning just because they're CFP professionals, which means they don't have to adhere to all the rest of the practice standards when delivering financial planning, which I think is a problem. The objection to this provision, and the reason why it was dropped, is that there are a lot of CFP professionals who don't actually do financial planning with all of their clients or even with any of their clients, and they didn't want to have a presumption that every client working with them as a CFP professional would get financial planning when not every client working with a CFP professional is getting financial planning. Except that's the problem. There are so many CFP professionals using the CFP marks and holding out to the public as certified financial planners without actually doing financial planning or being accountable for it, which creates a lot of confusion for consumers. Basically, CFP boards telling the public, the CFP marks are the gold standard for financial planning advice, but don't presume that you're going to get financial planning from a CFP just because you hire one. Especially since there's no upfront disclosure requirement to clarify whether you're going to be getting financial planning advice from your CFP or not. In fact, even under the revised standards, someone who's providing what's basically non-financial planning financial advice doesn't even need to define and clarify the scope of their engagement as excluding financial planning advice. So it's fine to say you're a CFP professional, which implies you're going to give financial planning advice, then not actually give any financial planning advice, and then not be responsible for the fact that you said you were a CFP but skipped the entire financial planning process. Basically, we're going to end out with two types of CFPs. CFPs who provide financial planning advice, and CFPs who provide non-financial planning financial advice and therefore don't have to adhere to the practice standards for financial planning. Now, you might be asking, what's the difference between financial planning advice and non-financial planning financial advice? Exactly. Confusing, isn't it? If you look at the CFP board's definition of financial advice, it's basically developing a financial plan, giving advice on buying or selling products, or managing portfolios or identifying third-party managers. So when you strip out the financial planning part, basically what you're left with is selling products and managing portfolios is non-financial planning financial advice, where you can hold out as a CFP professional to gain the client's trust, not give any financial planning advice, and have no accountability for not doing financial planning while you sold the product or managed the portfolio. Even though that's probably what the client was expecting when you wrote CFP on your business card. Right? We don't waive the standards for doctors who provide non-medical health advice. We don't waive the standards for CPAs who provide non-accounting financial advice. But we're waiving the standards for CFPs who provide non-financial planning financial advice. And under these standards, again, there's not even a requirement that this limited scope of engagement be disclosed to the client, although maybe at least that's a loophole we can close with a final revision. Now, all of these CFP professionals, including those who provide non-financial planning financial advice, will still be subject to a fiduciary standard. But frankly, I don't know how the CFP board intends to enforce that when there are no practice standards or any existing case law to explain how you apply a fiduciary duty to non-financial planning financial advice. I mean, this is a horrible can of worms that the CFP board is opening for itself. At the same time, it's allowing salespeople to continue to market themselves as certified financial planner professionals and not be doing any actual financial planning, which I think is horribly confusing and misleading to the public. Now, the point here is not literally to say every CFP professional should always have to do a comprehensive financial plan for every client, because not every client wants or needs a full scope financial plan. But the presumption that a CFP professional is doing a financial plan, unless proven otherwise, and a requirement that there be a written scope of engagement to clearly define when a CFP professional is not doing financial planning, is basic consumer protection. Otherwise, the CFP board is just encouraging misleading advertising for people to use the CFP marks to say they're a financial planner and then not do financial planning. And ultimately, this is where I intend to focus at least my public comment letter when the second comment period opens up on January 2nd. And if all of you agree this is concerning, I hope that you'll submit a public comment letter as well. Not to say that every CFP professional must do financial planning for every client, but to emphasize to the CFP board that when a CFP professional holds out to the public as a CFP, the consumer should be able to safely assume they're going to be getting financial planning to the full standards that apply to financial planning, unless a clear agreement stipulates that they're not, and the CFP professional discloses this is not financial planning advice. In other words, this is both a disclosure issue and an issue of the presumption of planning when you hold out as a CFP professional in the first place. In the meantime, for those who want to check out the full revisions to the proposed standards of professional conduct, the CFP board actually did a really good job providing a lot of detail around not just the revised proposal, but a redline version of the revisions between prior versus current, and a side-by-side document showing all the changes comparing the now proposed standards versus the ones that exist today. The 30-day comment period itself opens up January 2nd in just a week and a half. You can submit comments directly on the CFP Board's website, or you can write them in, email them in to comments@cfpboard.org. And I hope all of you will. I hope this is food for thought around this first look at the new standards of professional conduct that, frankly, once implemented, are going to guide our obligations as CFP professionals for many years to come. The good news is that the fiduciary standard remains, but the bad news is that the details still matter in how it's defined, when it's applied, the standards that are used to evaluate fiduciary conduct if an enforcement action comes, and the manner in which it's enforced. So I hope you'll all take your time to submit your own public comment letter and state your views on how you think this should work in the future. For all of you that still have concerns about CFP board, it's not a reason to drop your CFP marks. It's a reason to get involved including and especially in moments like this, and submit your comments so they're heard. The CFP board is reading them. In any event, thank you for joining us today. This is Office Hours with Michael Kitces. Normally 1 p.m. East Coast time on Tuesdays, but I delayed our broadcast to Wednesday this week so we could talk about the release of these new standards. But again, thanks for joining us, everyone, and have a great day.